Hi guys, welcome back to The Wargamer. Now, a few years ago I produced a couple of videos on the tabletop combat game called Wings of Glory, and since then the company that made that original game, Ares Games, have produced another game called Tripods and Triplanes. Now, you may have already figured out what that game is about based on these miniatures that I have on the right hand side. These are basically War of the Worlds tripods, and Tripods and Triplanes is basically a mashup of Wings of Glory and War of the Worlds. So we have some really nice miniatures on the side here. I'll get to these a little bit later on, but basically the game is the original core rules that we had for Wings of Glory, with a few changes to allow for combat for these walkers and also the different technological weaponry that these guys are using. Now in this video I'm going to be talking about some of the rules, some of the miniatures and things like that. Now Ares Games actually currently have this game in Kickstarter, and basically they've sent me a demo copy of this game so I can show you everything here. So a few of the items that you may see might not look quite great because they basically just print off cardboard tokens and things like that, but this is just basically an idea as to how the miniatures will look and also how the game will play. So speaking of rules, let's get started and talk about some of the rules changes that we have in Tripods and Triplanes. Now, the rules for Tripods and Triplanes is very much based on those original core rules that we had for Wings of Glory. So everything's controlled by drawing out cards for movement and also cards for damage. There's no dice or anything involved in this game. So instead of going over all those rules again, what I would recommend you do is check out my previous Wings of Glory video, which I'll include a link to in the description below. So pause the video now if you're not aware of how this game plays, watch that video, get yourself a better idea of how that plays, and then come back and we'll talk about some of the Martian specific rules. So first things first, let's talk about how movement works for these tripods. Now the movement for the planes is pretty much the same as Wings of Glory, but tripods obviously are different because they don't fly. So they still use the movement decks, which you are probably familiar with if you've looked at how these planes work in Wings of Glory. So we have these cards here which denote the movements, and you select these at the beginning of each turn. You have to select 3 of these, and they get revealed at each phase, and the maneuver is actually performed at that step. That basically means you have to really think ahead about what movements you want to do and where your opponents are going to be. However, because these guys are walkers, they don't have to continuously move like these planes do. They do have a few additional options. For example, they can stay stationary. They don't have to move. And in fact, they have to stay stationary at least 1 phase per turn. Basically, these guys don't have a lot of energy. They have to conserve that energy and can't always be moving around all the time. I'll come back to how energy works in this game when I look at weapons and things like that. We also have a few additional moves. We have moves like this, which basically require the tripod to stay still at that particular phase, but the next phase they can actually move backwards without having to change their facing. And there's also a few other items in this that the tripods get, and I'm going to mention them briefly here, but come into more specific focus later on. Now we have these energy tokens here, and also these little blocker tokens here. Now basically the tripods are unique because before their movement, they can actually perform an action. Basically means they can attack, they can recharge, they can change their facing, they can fire black smoke, they can do a range of different things, but if they use a movement like this, they are going to be blocked from doing that. So you can see a lot of these cards don't have them, but some of these more strenuous actions actually do. So that's pretty much it for movement. Everything else works pretty much the same way. You place down the arrow lining up on these smaller white arrows on here and maneuver the back to line up with the arrow there. So very much straightforward. If you're familiar with how these guys move, you're immediately familiar with how these guys move as well. The next set of changes that we have for these Martians come in the form of their cards. Now you may recognize many of these symbols from the original Wings of Glory base game. For example, this is the movement deck, and if I just bring in the movement cards, you will notice that they have a 2 letters on them. This is basically the different moves that each one can do. So we have TB cards there, and also TA cards as well. So this basically just denotes the different movement styles of some of the different tripods. Again, we also have a similar denotion here, which is basically the attack deck that this particular tripod uses. So this one is X, and if I just bring in some damage cards from over here, you can see that we have some Ys, we have some X's, and we also have some Z's at the bottom there as well. So basically you just choose the number of cards from, the set of cards that go with the corresponding tripod when you're dealing damage to your opponents. This is basically the power of the weapon. The next value that we have here is basically the hit points of the tripod, how much damage it can sustain before it is destroyed, and then we also have down here the amount of energy that this tripod has and also how much it recharges. So it starts off with a maximum of 12 energy, and basically this gets expended whenever it fires a weapon, depending on the movements it uses and other items as well. We also have this as the recharge value whenever the tripod wants to recharge their energy, be it through an objective or their other actions, then this is how much they will regain each time they do that. The bottom token at the bottom here is how much they can move when they change facing. So this one is basically quite kind of a wide, they can basically spin pretty much 90 degrees in either direction. So that's pretty much a very straightforward card. They're a very easy reference point as well when you want to know the stats of each of your tripods. So I've already briefly shown them, but we have a slightly different variation on the damage decks that we use for the biplanes in this game. Instead of using the Wings of Glory damage decks, we instead use the tripods and triplanes one. And there is a reason for this, but when selecting your deck, you still use the denotation of the letter associated with the plane. You can see this plane here is an A, and so we're going to be using the cards from the A deck here. If I flip these over, you'll become apparent as to why these cards are different from the ones in Wings of Glory. A lot of these have these little symbols at the top here, which basically denote that these are going to expend energy when they hit these tripods. They basically want to whittle down that energy to reduce the effectiveness and the damage output of these guys. But we also have a few other symbols which have some tripod-specific effects. You can see the symbols that we have here that wouldn't normally have any use in a regular Wings of Glory game. But basically, we also have things like jams and stuff going on, which you would easily recognize. And the reason for this is because things like stunning the pilots and things like that wouldn't work quite the same way for these guys as it would do for these planes. So that's going to be something you need to be aware of, that there are a different range of damage cards and also symbols that the flying player, the human player, needs to be aware of. So by now you should have a good grasp of how the core mechanics differ in tripods and triplanes from those in Wings of Glory. And now what we're going to do is we're actually going to focus on the Martian specific rules that we have here, including some of their bases. So let's put some of these planes away and just focus on these guys over here. Now straight away, you may have noticed that the Martians' bases are a lot different from the flying bases of the biplanes, and I'm going to be briefly explaining what these various symbols and lines and shapes mean on these items. So first of all, let's get this particular tripod here, the Mach 4. Now this is very clear to actually see, so I'm going to explain it by removing this from its stand slightly. There we go. So you can see here that we have a different shaped base for one, and this basically just factors in the different arcs of firing that this particular vehicle has. We also have several symbols. Now these all denote different weaponry. The two symbols here, these yellow little, basically that symbol but yellow, so it doesn't really show very well on the camera. These are your lighter energy weapons, and this is your heavier energy weapon. So that's I think medium heat rays and also the heavy heat ray there. Now instead of using the regular Wings of Glory template, which I'll just bring in here, this is what the planes use and still use in tripods and triplanes. You instead use a slightly different template, and this is basically a very unusual style template instead of the very basic straightaway. You can see how it's slightly tapered and also large on one end, and we also have these different angles here. Now this isn't actually because it's damaged and cut, this is just the way it works. So if you want to fire it from this position, you can fire it using that, you can fire it like that. So you basically just fire your weaponry from different angles. This basically allows you to do a 45-degree hit from this front weaponry here. So this is the medium heat rate. This is a little bit smaller, about the same size as the regular kind of ruler that we use for Wings of Glory. However, we also have a heavy one, which as you can see is pretty huge. It's going to give you a really good ranged advantage over some of the biplanes, and this is actually fired on this particular vehicle from the front arc, like you can see there. So this actually does more damage as well. Now the black symbols that we actually have here are another weaponry that we haven't really encountered in Wings of Glory. Now these represent black smoke, and if I bring in this template here, you can see we have this large oval shape of black smoke. Now this is a corrosive smoke that the tripods can deploy, and the basically creates a barrier or a battlefield obstacle that the biplanes don't want to encounter. Basically, this will stay on the battlefield until an enemy triplane actually flies through it, in which case it will take some damage. So you can actually block off large areas of the battlefield using this smoke. Now this is launched in a slightly different way. If I move these out of the way quickly, just bring in this arc, you basically set this little, this is a very basic kind of counter here. I imagine that in the full game after Kickstarter it will look a lot different from this. So you basically place that down there on the actual line, and then you can place this anywhere so long as the end of here fits in this circle. So you can see you can place it like that, twist it around any way you want. And like I said, this stays on the battlefield until those planes have been taken care of. So we have another feature about these bases, and these are basically energy shields. And you see this orange line here. Now for this tripod, the energy shields are actually at the back of itself. There you can see we've got a lot of damage output at the front and mainly defensive capabilities at the back, and this changes depending on the particular tripod. So we have, I think this is the Mach 3, has it at the front there. The Mach 1 has it at the back, and the Mach 2 has both a front and a back one, but nothing at the side. So these are basically weak points that you don't want to attack from. So the way these work, it's a very, very kind of simplistic view on how these work, but essentially you can reduce the damage value that you have from the card. So for example, if I just get a value card from a damage deck placed around here, so this is just an example here. If this was actual rolled drawn by a biplane, instead of doing 5 damage, it would not do any damage at all. I think it expends an energy token, however, but if it's one of those specialist cards with a symbol on the top, that symbol still takes effect. It basically just absorbs some of the incoming fire at the expense of some energy. So you can see how important it is that you want to drain the energy of these tripods very quickly. With the Martian vehicles looked at, let's talk about the action step. So here I have a basic setup of what you would imagine a Martian player would have in their game. Now the console may look different than this in the main game. I'm just using the Wings of Glory console that I already have just to better illustrate what each of these areas are. Now, as I've already mentioned, the movement phase itself pretty much takes the same kind of process as Wings of Glory. You decide on your maneuvers early on, you put them face down, and then you flip them over simultaneously each turn and perform those maneuvers. So you really have to think ahead. However, there is one difference that you take when you're playing as the Martian player compared to the human player. Instead of revealing your maneuver, you instead choose an action to perform in that particular phase before you flip it over. So for example, at the beginning here we have a movement. So I already know that, so what I'm going to be thinking I want to do is maybe, for example, change facing, for example. This basically allows me to perform the movement denoted on here and then also modify my facing based on the value that we have here, which basically allows me to do a 45-degree turn like so. So there's also different tokens that you can use and different actions you can perform at this stage. We have things like firing black smoke. We have we can fire weaponry. We have I just can't find here. We can have things like destroying objectives, which is basically often the Martians' main thing, and we can also have things like recharging as well, so you can restore that energy. Now that energy is very, very important for these tripods, as I've already mentioned, because that controls your shields, allows you to do certain maneuvers, it allows you to fire your weaponry. You don't want to drop below your charge level because you could even get toppled over as well. So you really don't want to. You want to keep that energy managed throughout this game. But apart from that, the actual gameplay sequence plays out pretty much the same. You choose your action, you reveal your maneuver, perform your maneuver. In the next phase, choose an action, reveal your maneuver. In this case, a stationary maneuver, which you're required to do at least once per phase. And then we continue along performing actions and performing maneuvers as you play. So hopefully you now have a basic grasp as to how the rule mechanics works for tripods versus triplanes. It's a very simple game to play, much like the original Wings of Glory. There is a slightly different aspect to the rules, obviously by playing as the Martian player compared to the human player, but the rules themselves are all very clear and very straightforward and easy to understand. So at the moment we have 4 different types of tripod. We have the Mach 1 Locust, the Mach 2 Scarab, the Mach 3 Squid, which is the smallest of all 3 of the tripods. And finally, the largest and most fearsome of all of the tripods, the Mach 4 Cuttlefish. Now all of these miniatures are made from a fairly soft plastic, which is great because whilst they're quite spindly, you don't want to be accidentally knocking components off or breaking or snapping components if they're too thin. So this really does help with storage and also the gameplay of them as well. Now all of the tripods come pre-assembled and also pre-painted, which is great because it means you can take them out of the box and start playing with them straight away without needing to worry about gluing or painting anything. Now whilst the paint jobs on these miniatures certainly won't win any awards, they are pretty nice and clean and do have a good variety of colour on them as well. Now, by far my favourite part about all these Martians is their aesthetics. They really do look fantastic, and I really like the fact that they've been based around that late 1800s, early 1900s aesthetic. They're very Victorian science fiction in their appearance. They're not quite as sleek and slender as some of the later incarnations, but they do have that kind of alien-esque appearance, whilst also being slightly steampunk in their appearance as well. Now, as I did mention earlier on, this game is currently in Kickstarter and will be running until December 20th. And I'll include a link in the description below to take you directly to the Kickstarter page for Tripods and Triplanes, where you can pledge your support and get some of the components a little bit earlier and also a little bit cheaper than retail as well. So again, a big thank you to Ares Games for allowing me to share this preview with you guys, and also thanks for watching as well. Now, if you're interested in seeing more of this game in the future, please do let me know in the comments below, and I can always do some more videos about it when it gets released properly. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.